Welcome back to Lantern Lake Stories. Tonight, find yourself a comfortable place. Pull your blanket a little closer, let your shoulders drop, and let your breathing slow all the way down. Because tonight I want to tell you something true, something that happened in a quiet valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, where the fog moves like something alive in the early morning hours, and the creek sounds like a lullaby no one ever wrote down, but everyone somehow already knows. There is a house at the end of a gravel road that most people have forgotten exists, sitting just beyond a stand of old oak trees, its white paint worn soft by decades of mountain weather, its porch holding two old rocking chairs side by side, as though they have been waiting a very long time for someone to come and sit in them. Most people drove past that road their whole lives without ever noticing the old wooden mailbox half swallowed by honeysuckle at the edge of the highway, and most people never knew what was at the end of it. There was one woman, though, who found it on a rainy October night when she had almost nothing left and nowhere particular to go, and what she found there, or maybe what found her, changed everything she thought she understood about home, about loss, and about the quiet miracle of beginning again. This is the story of Eleanor Marsh, and this is the story of the house that remembered her. The night Eleanor Marsh drove through the mountains of Virginia, she had exactly $43 in her wallet, a suitcase held shut with a canvas belt she had borrowed from an old backpack, and a handwritten address on the back of a gas station receipt that she was not entirely sure she had read correctly. The rain had started somewhere around Charlottesville and had not stopped since, coming down in long silver threads across the windshield while her wipers worked unevenly, one moving a half-second faster than the other, so that everything beyond the glass had a rhythm to it, a kind of pulse, as though the road itself were breathing in and out beneath her tires. She was 38 years old, and she felt that night like someone who had been walking through a house for years only to realize, all at once, that none of the furniture was hers, that none of the rooms had ever truly belonged to her, and that she had simply been moving through someone else's idea of a life without quite noticing until it was too late to pretend otherwise. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier. The apartment in Baltimore had been sublet to a young couple she had never met, whose moving boxes she had seen stacked in the hallway on her way out the very last morning. She had paused in that hallway for a moment with her single suitcase beside her and the smell of old carpet and someone else's coffee already seeping under the door. And she had thought, with a strange calm she did not entirely trust, that she did not know where she was going. That was the honest truth of it, the plain and unadorned center of her situation on that particular Tuesday night in October. And she had decided somewhere around the Maryland border that the honest truth was the only thing worth holding on to when everything else had already let go. She had driven south without a real plan, following something she could not have named precisely, an instinct, maybe, or a memory, or the particular pull that a place can have on a person even before the person understands why. She had a folder of papers from a probate attorney in Richmond named Gerald Foss, who had a voice like warm gravel and who had told her, gently and more than once, that she was under no legal obligation to visit the property in person, that she could simply sign the documents and have the estate liquidated, that it would all be much simpler that way. She had thanked Gerald Foss very sincerely for his advice and had driven south anyway, because the property, a house, the document said, with 4 acres of land in a small valley outside of a town called Calder's Mill, had belonged to her great-aunt Vera, and the moment Gerald Foss had said that name over the phone, Vera Holloway, formerly of Calder's Mill, Eleanor had felt something shift inside her chest. Something like a door moving on a hinge that had been perfectly still for a very long time. She had met Vera exactly twice in her life, and both of those meetings had been brief and separated by many years, and yet they had left the kind of impression that does not wear away with time, but instead seems to deepen, the way certain colors deepen when you look at them in low light. The first time had been when Eleanor was 7 years old, at a family reunion at her grandmother's house in Roanoke. On a summer afternoon with paper plates and potato salad and a yard full of relatives she saw only once a year and could never quite keep straight. She remembered Vera as a tall woman with silver hair and deep brown eyes that looked like they were always watching something just a little beyond whatever was directly in front of them, something interesting and far away. She had worn a green linen dress and had smelled like lavender and cedar and something faintly smoky, like old wood fires, and she had taken Eleanor's small hands in both of hers and said, in a low and unhurried voice, that Eleanor looked like someone who paid attention, and that paying attention was the most important thing in the world. Eleanor had been 7 years old and had not known what to do with that, so she had nodded politely and gone back to her paper plate, but the words had stayed somewhere inside her, lodged in some quiet corner of herself, waiting. The second time she had seen Vera was at her grandmother's funeral, when Eleanor was 22, on a cold November morning with a pale sky and bare trees and the particular stillness that cemeteries have in late autumn, when the leaves are all down and there is nothing left to soften the lines of things. Vera had stood apart from the rest of the family near a row of bare dogwood trees, not crying, just standing very still and looking at the casket as though she were having a private conversation with it, one that did not require words and did not need witnesses. When the service was over and people were filing back to their cars in that quiet, shuffling way of funeral crowds, Vera had pressed Eleanor's arm gently and said that she should come visit someday, that the mountains were good for the kind of thinking she needed to do. Eleanor had smiled and said she would, and she had not, and then the years had passed the way years do, faster than they seem like they should and quieter than you expect, and she had not thought of Vera again until Gerald Foss called and said her name over the phone, and something in Eleanor's chest moved on its long still hinge. Now she was winding up into the mountains on a two-lane road with no shoulder, the headlights cutting pale cones through the dark and the fog, the GPS on her phone dropping signal every few minutes, and then picking it back up again with a small, uncertain chirp that reminded her of a bird not entirely sure whether it was morning yet. The road curved and climbed in long, slow bends, and the trees pressed in close on either side, and occasionally the fog would thin for a moment, and she could see the dark shape of a ridge against the slightly lighter dark of the sky, and then the fog would come back and close everything down again to just the road and the rain and the pale reaching of her headlights. She had been driving for almost 11 hours, and she was tired in a way that went deeper than ordinary road tiredness, tired in her bones and her chest and the back of her eyes, tired in the particular way of someone who has been holding themselves together through a long and difficult season and has not yet been given permission to put any of it down. The gravel road, when she finally found it, was very easy to miss, and she almost did miss it entirely. She had gone a quarter-mile past it before something made her stop. Not the GPS, which had given up entirely about a mile back and was now showing a small blue dot floating in a featureless sea of gray, but something else, some pull she could not have explained at the time and did not try to. She stopped in the road, her hands on the wheel, and sat there for a moment in the rain. And then she backed up slowly with her hazard lights blinking orange into the wet dark until her headlights caught the mailbox. It was a wooden post, old and slightly leaning, with a tin mailbox on top that had been painted red once but had faded to a dusty rose, and the honeysuckle had grown up around it so thoroughly that only the very top of the mailbox was visible. But there was a number on it, barely readable, but there. 4 and then 4 and then 1. 441 Hollow Creek Road. She turned onto the gravel and drove slowly into the dark. The trees came in close on either side of the road immediately. Enormous old oak trees with bare October branches reaching over the gravel and interlacing overhead like the arched ceiling of a cathedral, and the rain dripped from their branches in a constant, gentle patter onto the roof of her car and onto the wet, dark gravel below. She drove for what felt like longer than it probably was, maybe 3 minutes, moving carefully and slowly through that cathedral of oaks with the rain and the dark pressing in from every side. And then the trees opened up quite suddenly, and there was the house. She stopped the car and sat there with the engine running and the wipers still going. And she looked at it through the rain and through the streaked glass of the windshield, and she took a slow breath. It was not a grand house, not the kind of house that would stop anyone on a different kind of night, but it had a presence that she felt immediately and could not quite account for. It was a 2-story farmhouse, white or once white, with a covered porch running the full length of the front and 2 old rocking chairs sitting on that porch side by side, still and patient in the rain. The windows on the first floor were dark and the windows on the second floor were dark, but there was something. She noticed it immediately, and she could not explain it, only that it was there, something in the quality of the dark inside those windows that was not quite the same as the dark outside them. The inside dark felt warmer, somehow. She turned off the engine and sat for another moment, listening to the rain on the roof of her car and the creak and drip of the big oaks around her, and, beneath all of that, just barely audible, the sound of a creek somewhere nearby, a low, soft, running sound threading up through the rain, like something breathing in the dark. Then she got out of the car and walked through the rain to the porch. The rain was cool on her face and in her hair, and the gravel was soft and wet underfoot, smelling of stone and fallen leaves, and the 3 wooden porch steps were solid beneath her feet as she climbed them. And the moment she stepped under the porch roof and out of the rain, the whole quality of the world around her shifted. The rain became something she was listening to rather than something she was inside of, and the sound of the creek became more distinct, and the smell of the porch came to her all at once. Old wood and dried lavender, and something faintly sweet and faintly green that she could not immediately name, but that felt, strangely, like something she already knew. She found the key exactly where Gerald Foss had told her it would be, beneath a flat river stone to the left of the front door, an old brass key slightly tarnished, with a loop of faded green ribbon through its bow. She stood with it in her hand for a moment and felt the weight of it, which was heavier than she expected a key that size to be, and then she unlocked the door and stepped inside. The front hallway was narrow and dark, and she stood there without moving for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, and the smell of the house came to her before anything else. Cedar and old paper and dried lavender, and something warm and indefinite underneath all of that. Something like a kitchen where bread had been baked many times over many years and the memory of it had settled permanently into the walls. She found a light switch by feel on the wall beside her and clicked it on, and a ceiling fixture with a simple glass globe came to life overhead in a warm, yellowish light, and Eleanor stood in the hallway of Vera Holloway's house and looked at what that light showed her. There were photographs on the walls of the hallway, old ones in wooden frames, black and white images of people she did not recognize, women in long dresses, men in overalls, children with the serious faces that children in old photographs always seem to have, as though the long exposure times of early cameras required a kind of patience that showed up in the face's gravity. And mixed among these older photographs were some in color from later decades, a mountain landscape in autumn, all orange and gold blazing across a ridge, a creek in summer with the light lying on the water in long bright lines, a close-up of a garden with tall purple irises and big white peonies. And at the end of the hallway, slightly larger than the others and in a frame just a little more carefully chosen, there was a photograph that stopped Eleanor completely when she saw it. It was a photograph of herself. She stepped closer and looked at it, and she could tell from her own face in the image that she was maybe 9 or 10 years old, could tell by the particular gap in her smile, where she had lost a tooth she could not now remember losing, could tell by the way her hair was cut and the shirt she was wearing, something she had worn in that period of her childhood without remembering it distinctly. She was standing in a garden, squinting slightly against the sun, and she was holding a flower, a purple one, an iris maybe, and she was grinning with the kind of uncomplicated happiness that a 10-year-old carries naturally, and that a 38-year-old remembers the way you remember a dream, with feeling rather than detail. She had no memory of this photograph being taken, no memory of being in this particular garden, no memory of visiting this house or this valley at any point in her childhood. And yet there she was, on the wall of her great-aunt Vera's hallway, 9 or 10 years old and grinning in a garden. She stood looking at the photograph for a long moment, and then she looked away and took a slow, deliberate breath and decided, with the particular pragmatism of someone who is very tired, to go find a bed and deal with the rest of it in the morning. She moved through the house briefly, getting a sense of its layout. A sitting room off the hallway with a stone fireplace and 2 deep armchairs, and a small braided rug in faded reds and blues, a bookcase along one wall going floor to ceiling and full, the spines of poetry and field guides and novels pressing gently against each other in the yellowish light. A kitchen at the back of the house with a round table and 4 chairs and a wood-burning stove beside a basket of old firewood, a collection of pottery mugs on a shelf beside the coffee maker, each one different from the others, clearly handmade, with different glazes and slightly uneven handles in the way that handmade things have. She opened a cabinet almost by instinct and found coffee and tea and a tin of crackers and 2 cans of soup and a jar of local honey with a hand-lettered label that said Blue Ridge Wildflower. And she understood that someone had thought of this, had put these things here for her, had wanted her to arrive to something rather than nothing. She filled a glass with water from the tap and drank it slowly, standing at the sink, looking at her own reflection in the dark window in front of her, pale, tired, her hair damp from the rain, her eyes looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read, but that seemed to contain more things than she was ready to sort through tonight. She made a mental note to ask Gerald Foss in the morning who had left the food, and then she went upstairs. There were 3 rooms on the upper floor, and the first was clearly Vera's own room. A 4-poster bed with a white quilt, a dresser with a mirror, a small writing desk by the window, and she did not linger there, because it felt too intimate, too much like walking into the middle of someone else's dream. The second room was small and clearly unused for a very long time, with a bare mattress and a single wooden chair and curtains that had once been white and were now a very pale, patient yellow. But the third room, at the end of the short hallway, had its door slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open gently and reached for the light, she found something she had not expected. The room had been prepared for her. The bed had fresh linens. She could smell the laundry smell of them from the doorway, clean and faintly floral. And there were 2 pillows and a folded extra blanket at the foot of the bed. On the nightstand there was a small lamp and a glass of water that was clearly fresh. She could tell by the tiny bubbles still clinging to the inside of the glass, and beside the glass, on the nightstand, there was a note. It was on a small piece of cream-colored stationery, folded once, and the handwriting on it was old-fashioned but clear, the letters formed with the particular care of someone who believed that handwriting mattered. She crossed to the nightstand and picked it up and unfolded it, and it said, "Eleanor, I am so glad you came. Rest now. The house will tell you the rest in its own time." It was signed with only a V. She read it twice, standing there in that prepared room with the lamp glowing warm and the rain talking softly against the window and the sound of the creek threading up through the night from somewhere below. And then she set it back down on the nightstand very carefully, as though it were fragile, and she sat on the edge of the bed. Vera had been dead for 6 weeks. Gerald Foss had said nothing about any note. The house had been locked, and only the neighbor, a Mrs. Garland, had apparently had any access to it. And yet here was a note on a nightstand, in a room that had been made up with fresh linens and a fresh glass of water, written in handwriting that was unmistakably Vera's. She sat with all of this for a moment, pressing her fingers against her closed eyes, and when she took them away the room was exactly as it had been. Warm, quiet, prepared, patient. She could not explain the note. and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not frightened by it. The only thing she could identify in herself, sitting on that bed in that room in that mountain house with the rain outside and the creek below, was something that felt very close to relief, which was perhaps the strangest part of all. She changed into the soft sweater and old pants she had packed on top of everything else, brushed her teeth in the small bathroom across the hall, and got into bed. The sheets were soft and the pillow was deep, and the sound of the rain against the window was patient and constant and entirely unhurried. And the sound of the creek beneath it was like something she had heard before, somewhere before memory properly begins. The way certain sounds feel ancient and familiar in a way you cannot trace to any specific moment of your life. She fell asleep almost before she had finished thinking about falling asleep, and she dreamed of a garden. Purple irises and white peonies and the smell of warm earth in summer, and at the edges of the dream, barely visible, a tall silver-haired figure in a green linen dress, and the sound of her own laughter, younger than she currently was, easy and unguarded and completely free. She woke to light. It came through the window in long, pale gold bars the way mountain morning light does, layered and moving and alive in a way that city light almost never is, filtering through the leaves of the big oaks outside and landing on the floor beside the bed in shifting patterns that were almost like writing, like something being slowly spelled out in a language made of light and leaf shadow. She lay still for a long moment and simply listened to the morning before doing anything else. The rain had stopped during the night, and in its place was the kind of morning quiet that you only encounter in the mountains, deep and dimensional, full of small sounds that would be entirely swallowed up by the noise of a city, but that here were perfectly distinct and perfectly clear. A bird somewhere close by, a single clear note, and then another. The creek, steady and bright now without the rain to blur it. The very tops of the oaks moving in a small, early wind. And somewhere farther away, a door closing softly. She lay still and listened to all of it. And for those first quiet minutes of that first mountain morning, she did not think about Baltimore or the apartment or the moving boxes stacked in someone else's hallway. She just lay in Vera's guest room and listened to the morning come through the window. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Then she got up and went downstairs and made coffee in Vera's kitchen, using the old drip coffee maker that gurgled and hissed, and then let out a long, satisfied sound as it finished. And she stood at the kitchen window while it worked and looked out at the back of the property for the first time, and she stopped, and she stood very still with her hands on the counter's edge, and she looked. The back of the house opened onto a wide, flat yard that in its day had clearly been a serious and lovingly tended garden. Even now, in mid-October, after what must have been some years of lessened care and attention, you could see the garden's bones, the underlying structure of it, the way you can see the strong structure of a face even when the light is not at its best. The shape of old stone paths wound between the beds. The dark, mounded shapes of overgrown lavender hunched like soft hills along the back edge. The proud, bare skeletons of what must have been, in their proper season, enormous and beautiful rose bushes. At the far end of the yard, before the land dropped away and the woods began their dark and patient presence, there was a small outbuilding with glass panels dulled by age but still intact. A greenhouse, she thought, still standing, still holding its shape. And along the left edge of the yard, close to the tree line where the big oak stood, she could see the creek through the gaps between the trunks, a glimmer of moving water catching the morning light and holding it briefly before releasing it downstream. She wrapped her hands around one of Vera's pottery mugs with the coffee warm inside it, and she stood at that window and felt something opening in her chest, some slow old ache like a muscle she had not used in a very long time and had not realized she was missing until it moved. She had always loved gardens. She had not had one in 9 years, not since she and David had lived in the house in Annapolis with the backyard that she had planted so carefully and given up so entirely when they moved to the Baltimore apartment, where there was nothing growing but a potted fern on the windowsill that she had kept alive out of stubbornness rather than joy. She took her coffee and went outside through the back door onto the narrow wooden step and then down into the yard, and the grass was wet with last night's rain and cold against her bare feet. She had forgotten to put shoes on, and she laughed at herself quietly for it, a small sound in all that mountain quiet. And then she walked slowly along one of the old stone paths anyway, her feet cold and wet, the grass between the stones thick and green, the coffee warm between her palms. She stopped in front of one of the lavender beds and crouched down over it. The plants were overgrown and woody at their bases, their growth tangled and ungainly from years of not being properly pruned back, but they were alive. She could see that immediately, and with a rush of something like gladness. She could smell them, too, faintly, beneath the cold morning air and the wet earth smell of last night's rain. The lavender was there, patient and persisting, surviving through simple stubbornness and the deep, particular loyalty of lavender to its own existence. She said, almost without meaning to say it out loud at all, "You're still here," and then felt a little foolish for talking to a plant, and stood up and kept walking down the stone path toward the creek. The creek, when she reached it, was beautiful in a way that arrived in her mind simply and without any qualifying language at all, the single word beautiful coming first and staying, because it was the right word and there was no reason to reach for another one. It was a small creek, maybe 10 feet across at its widest, running clear and cold over a bed of smooth round stones in copper and gray and pale tan, and the morning light came through the oaks at that low early angle and lay on the surface of the water in long, slow, shifting lines. The bank was soft with moss and fallen leaves, the leaves still richly colored from the night's rain, brown and orange and the particular yellow that October produces, and on the far bank a fern bent its fronds over the water. A fallen log lay across part of the stream, covered in soft green moss, and on the log a small gray bird was sitting and turning its head to look at her with the enormous, unconcerned precision of a bird that has decided you are neither a threat nor a particularly interesting development. She looked back at it and said good morning, and the bird flew away as though it had somewhere more important to be. She stood by the creek for a long time with her empty coffee mug, and when the mug was empty, she still stood there listening to the water move over the stones with that particular sound it makes, half whisper and half song. While the oaks moved very gently overhead in the small morning wind, and the whole of that October morning felt like the inside of a held breath, something beautiful and still and not yet decided. When she finally went back inside, she ate crackers with honey standing at the kitchen counter, and she thought about the note on the nightstand, and she thought about the photograph in the hallway, and then she called Gerald Foss. He answered on the second ring, in his warm gravel voice, and asked if she had made it all right and mentioned that the weather had looked rough. She told him she had made it and that the house was beautiful, actually, and then she asked him whether he had arranged for food to be left in the kitchen. He told her he had not, that he had given the key placement to the neighbor, a woman about a mile up the road named Mrs. She asked then whether there had been a note on the nightstand in the guest room, and there was a short pause, and Gerald Foss said he had not arranged for any note and suggested she ask Mrs. Garland, and he texted her the number a moment after they hung up. She went upstairs and looked at the note again before she called, standing there in the morning light with it in her hands, reading it a third time, feeling the weight of its few words, the impossible warmth of them, and then she folded it carefully and put it in the pocket of her jeans and went back downstairs to dial the number. A woman answered with a clipped, kind voice and said her name was Dottie Garland. And when Eleanor explained who she was, the woman's voice warmed immediately and completely, like a lamp being turned on in a cold room. And she said she was so glad Eleanor was there and asked how she was finding the house and whether she had slept all right. And she had just not wanted Eleanor arriving to an empty house. Eleanor thanked her for that sincerely and then asked, as carefully as she could manage, whether Dottie had left a note on the nightstand in the guest room. There was a pause, and then Dottie said, slowly, that she had not left a note, that she had made up the room and put the water glass out, but that she had not left a note, honey. The silence that followed was gentle and long, and Eleanor thanked her, and they said goodbye, and Eleanor stood in Vera's kitchen in the mountain morning with the creak audible through the slightly open window, and she thought about how a note in Vera's handwriting had arrived on a nightstand in a locked house that only Dottie Garland had entered, and Dottie Garland said she had left no note. She thought about this for a while, standing in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the creek running below, and then she decided that some things were simply not for figuring out right away, that some things asked you to sit with them a while before they showed you their shape, and that she was, as Vera had always said, someone who paid attention. And paying attention sometimes meant waiting patiently for the thing that was being shown to you to finish showing itself before you rushed to name it. She would wait. She would pay attention. She would let the house tell her the rest in its own time, exactly as the note had promised. She spent the rest of that first morning exploring the house slowly and properly, the way you might read a book you have been waiting a long time for, not rushing past anything, letting each room give you what it had before moving on to the next one. The sitting room in the daylight was lovelier than it had been in the lamplight the night before. The stone of the fireplace a pale blue-gray, the mantel crowded with small and particular objects, a smooth round river stone, a bird's nest under a glass dome, a tiny oil painting of a mountain in winter that was no larger than a postcard, a collection of small clay figurines that were all birds, each one different from the others, each one clearly shaped by hand, with that slight asymmetry and texture that machine-made things never have. She picked one of them up, a small round bird with textured wings and a knowing tilt to its head, and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was more than she expected, and its coolness, and then she set it back down carefully in its exact place. The bookcase she spent more time with, running her fingers along the spines and reading titles as she went, botany and wildflowers, Appalachian folklore and history, the geology of the Blue Ridge, and then a whole shelf of poetry, Mary Oliver and Wendell Berry and Pablo Neruda and Rumi and Emily Dickinson, their names on the spines like old friends at a long table. And at the very bottom of the bookcase, pushed slightly back as though they had not been meant to be hidden but had simply settled there over time, was a row of journals, 12 of them, each bound in a different material, plain cardboard, leather, fabric, one that appeared to be covered in a piece of old wallpaper, all the same size and all clearly from the same hand. She looked at the journals for a long time without touching them, and then she moved on to the small study off the sitting room, where there was a large wooden desk, old and beautiful, with a green-shaded lamp and a leather blotter, and a small wooden box in the center of the desk, closed with a tiny brass latch. The walls of the study were hung with watercolors, mountain landscapes mostly, painted with a loose and confident hand that knew exactly what it was doing and did not need to overwork any line to prove it. The creek in various seasons, the garden in summer and winter, a single bare tree against a white winter sky. She sat in the desk chair and it creaked under her gently, and she looked at the room and could almost see Vera sitting here, could almost feel the particular quality of presence that a person leaves in the room they have used most, the way their habits and their attention shape the air of a place long after they have gone from it. The afternoon arrived quietly, the October sky clearing to a deep and genuine blue, and the light through the study window came in warm and amber and fell across the desk in a slow-moving rectangle that shifted as the sun moved. She made soup from one of the cans she had found in the kitchen and ate it at the round kitchen table. And through the window she watched two deer, a doe and what must have been a young one from earlier in the year, still faintly spotted along the hindquarters, move through the far edge of the yard near the tree line, with that particular silent deliberateness that deer have, as though they are always moving through someone else's space and know it, and are being very careful not to disturb anything. She held her spoon suspended halfway between the bowl and her mouth and did not move, afraid to break the stillness. And the younger deer paused at the edge of the trees and looked directly at the kitchen window with dark, deep, utterly fearless eyes, and Eleanor looked back. And then they were gone into the trees as quietly as they had come, and she finished her soup. After lunch, she pulled on her jacket and her boots, which she found in the coat closet by the front door, along with a row of Vera's other coats, a canvas barn coat, a yellow rain slicker, a long wool coat the color of pine trees, and she went out to explore the grounds properly for the first time. She went first to the greenhouse at the far end of the garden, pulling open its stiff and slightly reluctant door and stepping inside into air that was warmer than the October air outside, heavy and green with a smell that was almost overwhelming in its aliveness even in mid-October. The plants that remained, herbs mostly, rosemary and thyme, and several varieties of mint in terracotta pots on the wooden benches along both walls, had not been watered in some time and were dry and somewhat wilted, but she could see immediately that most of them were still alive, still holding on with the particular stubbornness of plants that have not yet been given a compelling reason to give up. She picked up a rosemary plant in its pot and cradled it, and could feel the faint springiness still in a few of the stems, the color still present in the newer growth. And she carried it to the standing tap at the back of the greenhouse and watered it carefully. And then she went back and watered all the others, one by one, with the patience and attention that thirsty living things deserve. She stayed in the greenhouse for nearly an hour, watering and rearranging, moving plants to better light, turning pots so the growth could reach the sun more evenly. And her hands were happy doing all of it in a way she had almost forgotten hands could be. The smell of herb oils released when she brushed against the leaves, rosemary especially, that deep resinous green smell that always feels like it is clearing something out of you, filled the greenhouse around her, and she breathed it in and felt something in her shoulders slowly releasing. Some tension she had been carrying so long, she had stopped noticing it was there until it began, carefully and cautiously, to ease. She had not gardened in 9 years, not properly, not like this, not since David and the house in Annapolis and the life she had tried to build and had not been able to hold on to. She did not pursue that thought very far just yet, letting it exist at the edge of her awareness without pulling it into the center, because there was time, there was plenty of time, and the mountains were good for the kind of thinking you needed to do, and the house would tell her the rest in its own time. As she was finally leaving the greenhouse, pulling the stiff door shut behind her, she noticed something she had missed on the way in, something written on the inside of the door at just about eye level in what looked like a black paint marker, in handwriting she now recognized as Vera's. It said, "Tend to the small things, and the large things tend themselves." She stood there reading it for a moment with her hand still on the door, and then she let go of the door and stood in the garden in the late afternoon light with the smell of the greenhouse plants still on her hands and the oaks moving above her in the cold October air, and she felt something come loose inside her that had been held very tightly for a very long time, and she cried. She cried for maybe 5 minutes with her hands at her sides and her face turned slightly up toward the sky, and the oaks moved and the creek ran, and a crow called somewhere in the distance, and the amber October light went right on being amber and patient and beautifully indifferent to her grief, which was somehow the most comforting thing of all. When she was finished, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and went back inside. She made chamomile tea from the box she had found in the kitchen, and she carried it to the sitting room and settled into one of the deep armchairs by the fireplace, which she had built up from the basket of old firewood using a skill she had not drawn on in years, but that came back to her hands without trouble, and she reached down to the bottom shelf of the bookcase and took out one of Vera's journals. She took the oldest-looking one, the plain brown cardboard cover, and opened it to the first page. The pages inside were soft with age, and the ink had faded to a warm brown, and the handwriting was Vera's but younger, less settled, still finding its own particular confidence. The first entry was dated September 4th, 1971, which meant Vera had been about 26 when she wrote it, barely older than Eleanor's students used to be, barely older than what still felt, in memory, like very young. She had come to the house that day for the first time since her mother had died, had come with nothing but the car and 2 boxes and whatever it was she was trying to figure out, that the valley had been exactly as she remembered it, that the creek was running high from last week's rain and the garden was a disaster, and she had started crying the minute she got out of the car and had not stopped for about an hour. And then she had stopped and gone and gotten the hoe from the shed and started, and on the back beds. And after that she had felt better, and she did not know yet what this place was going to be for her, but she had felt better. Eleanor read that entry and then sat very still for a long time with the journal in her hands and the fireplace crackling quietly in front of her. And she thought about a 26-year-old woman arriving alone at this same house with 2 boxes and an unanswered question. And she thought about a 38-year-old woman arriving alone at this same house with a canvas-belted suitcase and a gas station receipt. And the similarity of it was so precise and so tender that she had to take a slow breath before she turned to the next entry. She read until it was full dark outside, and the fire had burned down to a deep bed of orange coals pulsing with each small movement of air in the room. She read about Vera's early years at the house, the loneliness of the first winter described in such vivid and particular detail that Eleanor could feel the cold of it coming off the page, the particular silence of a mountain house in February when the snow settles hard on the ridge and the world outside reduces itself to a few essential things: the fire, the light, the sound of the creek still running beneath the ice. She read about the neighbor, a Mrs. Hale who brought casseroles and opinions with equal frequency and apparently felt each was equally welcome, and about the garden, which Vera had attacked that first spring with a ferocity that she herself described as almost holy, pulling up old growth and amending soil and drawing plans on graph paper at the kitchen table by lamplight in the evenings. And she read about a man named Ray, who had appeared that second spring from somewhere down the road and helped Vera repair the greenhouse glass, and who had eyes, Vera wrote, the color of creek water in October, which Eleanor recognized immediately as the most specific and therefore the most accurate color description she had ever read in any journal or any novel. She reached for the second journal without putting the first one fully away. She was that deep in it by then, and she read with the small lamp on the side table glowing steadily beside her and the fire cooling slowly in front of her and her tea long cold in its mug. And Ray became a regular presence in those pages over the course of the next volume, appearing every few entries at first, and then every entry, and then in almost every paragraph. A quiet woodworker who fixed things and planted things, and who was, Vera wrote, the first person she had ever met who was as comfortable in silence as she herself was. And Eleanor found herself smiling at those passages without fully noticing that she was smiling. When she finally looked up from the second journal, it was 11 by the clock on the mantel. The fire was entirely cold, and the room was lit only by the small lamp beside her. She went to bed carrying something she had not had when she arrived, something she could not quite name yet, not happiness precisely. It was too early for that word, and she was too honest with herself to reach for a word she had not earned, but something adjacent to it, something warm and quietly attending, like the smell of the greenhouse that afternoon, full of things that were alive and returning. Possibility, maybe. She went asleep listening to the creek. The next morning she called her friend Cass, who had been telling her for 2 years that she needed to stop and slow down and find some ground beneath her feet, and who was also the kind of friend who never said "I told you so," which was one of the main reasons Eleanor had kept her for 15 years. After the catching up and the "how are yous," she told Cass about the house, about the gravel road and the mailbox and the dark windows that looked inhabited rather than empty, about the note she could not explain, about the photograph on the wall of the hallway, about the garden and the greenhouse and the journals with their brown faded ink. Cass listened to all of it with the focused, thinking kind of quiet that was one of her best qualities, and then she asked what it felt like being there, and Eleanor thought about that for a moment before answering. She said it felt like arriving somewhere she had not known she was trying to get to. Cass made a sound of deep satisfaction and told her to stay. Eleanor said she had to deal with the estate, and Cass said her name in a voice that was warm and entirely uncompromising and said to stay, and so she stayed. It had not been the plan. She had planned a few days, long enough to look through the property and sign what needed signing and form some opinion about whether to sell or rent or some combination. But plans have a way of dissolving in mountain air, especially when you have been sleeping better than you have in years and waking up every morning to the sound of a creak and spending your evenings learning the story of your gray tant's life through 12 handwritten journals on a shelf beside a fireplace. She called Gerald Foss and told him she was going to stay a while, and he was unsurprised and kind. She called her clients. She had been a freelance graphic designer for 3 years and confirmed that her current projects could be handled remotely without difficulty. She called the young couple subletting her Baltimore apartment and told them the arrangement might go longer than originally planned, and they said that was genuinely great and also asked about the parking pass. She went upstairs and unpacked her suitcase properly into the dresser drawers in the guest room. In the act of opening those drawers and placing her folded clothes inside them was, she found, unexpectedly significant, unexpectedly grounding, like a small and quiet declaration. She established a routine, which was something she had not had in a long time, and the routine felt like the external structure of something she was building internally at the same time. She woke with the light each morning, lying still for a few minutes before rising, listening to the birds and the creek and the oaks, letting the day come to her before she went to it. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, watching the yard come into itself in the early morning. The deer sometimes appearing at the tree line and moving through the far edge of the yard with that quiet deliberateness. The birds always coming to the back step and to the overgrown beds and to the creek bank with the busy intention of birds who have places to be and things to attend to. She drank her first cup at the kitchen table with a journal in her hands, reading Vera's life in installments, a few entries each morning, letting it digest. She ate breakfast simply, crackers and honey, oatmeal she found in the pantry, eggs from a small grocery she discovered in town the day she drove down the mountain for real provisions, and was grateful for the opportunity to have a proper conversation with another human being, which turned out to be more necessary than she had expected. After breakfast, she went out to the garden, and this became the center of her days, the thing the rest of the day organized itself around in the way that meaningful work does when you find it. She had been to the hardware store in town, Hargrove's, a place that smelled like motor oil and iron and rope, and that had in one corner a small but serious selection of garden tools and supplies. She had bought pruning shears and a new trowel and a long-handled cultivator, and she had spent 20 minutes in the fertilizer aisle getting advice from the younger Hargrove, whose father had started the place and who had retired to Florida, the younger one said, with a combination of pride and exasperation that was very specific and very recognizable, who knew a considerable amount about Blue Ridge mountain soil and was genuinely delighted to share that knowledge with someone who was genuinely interested in receiving it. She worked in the garden each morning until lunch, and the work was harder than she expected and more satisfying than she expected in precisely equal measure. She cleared the overgrown lavender beds, pruning the woody old growth back to where the new growth was coming in soft and silver green, using the shears Hargrove had recommended and finding that good tools make a noticeable difference in both the quality and the pleasure of the work. She turned the soil in the rose beds and worked compost into it, crouching low over the dark earth with her hands deep in it, the smell of it rising around her, that particular smell of healthy soil that is both ancient and alive. She repaired sections of the stone paths where frost heave had lifted and shifted the stones, resettling each one carefully and tamping it down with the heel of her boot. About a week into her residency, Dottie Garland appeared one morning around the side of the house, without any particular preamble, carrying a casserole dish and wearing rubber boots and a no-nonsense expression that was somehow also warm. Eleanor said she was very glad to meet her in person. Dottie was a small woman of around 70, with short white hair cut very practically and dark eyes that moved quickly and saw everything. Wearing a canvas work jacket and the kind of practical boots that belong to someone who has spent a great deal of their life outside and intends to continue doing so. She looked around the garden with the assessing eye of someone who knows what they are looking at. And she told Eleanor she was doing a good job and that those lavenders had been desperate. Eleanor said she thought they would come back, and Dottie said with great authority that of course they would, that lavender was essentially immortal, that you could set fire to that bed and something would still come up in the spring. And then she held out the casserole dish and said she had brought supper, chicken and dumplings. Eleanor took off her gloves and accepted it with genuine gratitude and said Dottie did not have to do that, and Dottie said she knew she did not have to. And then she looked toward the greenhouse and asked how it was coming along. They sat on the back step together in the October sun, Eleanor in her garden clothes with earth on her hands, Dottie with her casserole dish and her practical boots. And Dottie talked about Vera Holloway for almost 2 hours, and Eleanor listened with the full and careful attention she was learning in this valley to give to things. Dottie talked about how Vera had come to the house young and alone and set about making herself a life there with the kind of quiet determination that Dottie said she had never seen in another human being, not before and not since. She talked about how Vera had known every plant in the valley by its name and every bird by its call and every story attached to every corner of this particular landscape, and how she had helped half the town with one thing or another over the decades, bringing food and sitting with people and sharing seeds from her garden, and always with that quality of attention that made you feel, Dottie said, like you were the most important thing in the room, which was a quality that Dottie seemed to regard as one of the highest human achievements, and Eleanor was beginning to think she was right about that. When Eleanor asked about Ray, Dottie's face changed, softening in a particular way that has only one source, and she confirmed that Eleanor had been reading the journals. She told Eleanor that Ray Sutton had died in 1997, cancer, and that the two of them had never married, and that people had found that strange, two people who clearly loved each other as much as that. She told Eleanor that Vera had said once, and Dottie had thought about it for 30 years since, that marriage was for people who did not trust the thing itself, and that she and Ray trusted the thing itself. She shook her head slowly when she said it, in the way you shake your head at something so true it is almost hard to hold. When Eleanor asked what had happened after Ray died, Dottie said simply that Vera had stayed, because that was what Vera did. She stayed and she tended and she paid attention, and things eventually became what they were supposed to be. Eleanor carried that answer with her all afternoon, thinking about it while she repotted the rosemary in the greenhouse with her careful fingers working the roots free of the old pot, thinking about it while she walked to the creek in the late afternoon and stood with her boots in the soft moss of the bank and watched the water move over the stones, thinking about it while she warmed Dottie's chicken and dumplings on the stove and the smell of it filled the kitchen around her. She thought about what it meant to stay, not to endure staying or to survive staying, but to actually choose it, to put your tools down in one specific place and say, this is where I will be, this is what I will tend. Every decision since, cities, schools, jobs, the marriage, had been made with some part of her already oriented toward the exit, not because she was cowardly, She did not believe she was cowardly, but because staying had always felt to her like limitation, like a door closing. The house, she was beginning to understand, had a different relationship with that idea entirely. The weeks that followed moved through October and then into November with the particular quality of mountain autumn, which is both faster and deeper than autumn anywhere else. The oaks going from orange to brown to bare in what felt like a matter of days, the mornings arriving colder each time, the frost appearing first on the grass closest to the creek and then on the glass panels of the greenhouse each morning. A thin white layer that melted as the sun rose and left the glass streaming. She bought a heavier jacket at the small outdoor shop in town. She learned the names of the birds, one by one, the way you learn the names of new neighbors, gradually, through repeated encounter and close attention. The nuthatch came to the back step every single morning and was completely unafraid of her, working its way down the wooden railing headfirst with that particular upside-down confidence of nuthatches. The pileated woodpecker worked the dead tree at the edge of the oaks every afternoon with tremendous and industrious energy, the sound of its work carrying clearly across the yard. The great horned owl she heard every night but never saw. 2 long calls, and then a pause, and then 2 long calls again, so regular and reliable that it became a kind of clock, marking the deep part of the night from somewhere in the far oaks. She read through all 12 of Vera's journals over the course of 3 weeks, reading each evening by the fireplace. And what emerged from those 12 volumes, spanning from 1971 through the early years of the new century, was a portrait of a life so fully and carefully lived that Eleanor sometimes had to set the journal down in her lap and look at the fire for long minutes, not because the journals were sad, though they contained sadness, the way any honest record of a real life does, but because the overriding quality of them, the thing that required those long pauses, was the beauty of it, the sustained, accumulated beauty of someone who had decided, once and for all, when she was 26 years old and crying in a mountain garden, that she was going to pay attention, and had then simply done that, consistently, for the rest of her life. She called her mother for the first time in 8 months, which was a more complicated conversation than she was fully ready for, because her mother had opinions about the divorce and about Baltimore and about Eleanor's choices generally, and she expressed these opinions in a way that was meant to be helpful and often was not. But the conversation found its way eventually to Vera, as Eleanor had known it would, as she had perhaps called partly in order for it to do so. Her mother said that Vera was something, which Eleanor noticed was the same word Dottie had used, as though Vera Holloway required a particular word that other words did not quite cover. Her mother told her about a Christmas when Eleanor was around 5 years old, when Vera had sat on the living room floor with her for almost 2 hours while Eleanor showed her her rock collection, and Vera had asked questions about every single rock as though they were the most interesting things she had ever seen in her life. Eleanor did not remember this, but could see it perfectly and immediately, could see her 5-year-old self with a handful of rocks and Vera's full and unhurried attention, and the thought of it made her throat ache in a way that was not sad, but was something adjacent to grief without being grief, the ache of a gift you did not know you had received until it was named. Her mother told her then that Vera had called her about a year before she died, and had said that she wanted to make sure Eleanor got the house, not to sell it, but to find it. And when Eleanor's mother had said that Eleanor did not know what she needed, Vera had said that she would when she got there. Eleanor sat with this information quietly for a moment and then asked whether Vera had known, and her mother said she had always seemed to know something, which was as precise an answer as could probably be given. After she hung up, Eleanor sat in the study for a long time, and the creek talked through the slightly open window, and the amber lamp made its circle on the desk, and the small wooden box with the brass latch sat in the center of the desk, where it had been since the first morning, waiting, as it had been waiting every day since she arrived, for the time to be right. She had noticed the box that first morning. She had noticed it every day since without opening it, not because she had forgotten it or avoided it deliberately, but because something in her had said, quietly and consistently, "Not yet," the way certain things say not yet when you are paying attention to them. She looked at it now, in the lamplight, with the creek talking through the window and the autumn dark outside, and she reached out and lifted the tiny brass latch. Inside, on a small square of folded velvet, was a key, smaller than the front door key. Older, the metal worn smooth with years of handling, and beneath the velvet, folded carefully, was a piece of cream-colored stationery, the same cream-colored stationery as the note that had been on the nightstand. She unfolded it and read, "The key is to the drawer in the greenhouse workbench, on the right side. The one that sticks a little. Pull it hard. What's inside is for you. It has always been for you. I've been holding it a long time. I am glad you came, Eleanor. I always knew you would. You are someone who pays attention. That is the most important thing in the world." She read the note twice, and then she put on her boots and her jacket and took the key and walked out into the cold night. It was a clear night, the sky black and perfect and populated with stars in a quantity that does not exist in cities. The Milky Way a wide, luminous smear across the center of it all, and she stood in the yard for a moment with her head back and looked at the stars until her neck ached and her breath made small clouds in the cold air, and she felt appropriately small in the way that stars on a clear mountain night reliably produce. Then she walked to the greenhouse and worked the door open and clicked on the clip-on lamp she had installed on the workbench earlier in the month, and she went to the right side of the workbench, to the drawer with the lock, and she put the key in. She pulled the drawer and it stuck exactly as Vera had said it would, and she pulled harder and it came open with a deep wooden complaint, and inside was a tin box with a fitted lid, about the size of a shoebox, heavier than it looked when she lifted it out and set it on the workbench surface. Inside the tin she found a collection of things that together made up something larger than any of them individually. A packet of seed envelopes labeled in Vera's handwriting with rose varieties and lavender cultivars, and specific herb varieties she recognized from the garden. A set of loose photographs of the garden in different seasons cycling through itself over what must have been decades. A folded piece of graph paper that turned out to be Vera's detailed garden plan with notes on each bed and each plant in the same careful handwriting as the journals, a small notebook with planting schedules and soil notes, and a bird list going back to 1972, and a letter from Ray on simple notebook paper that she chose to read yet, folding it back with great care and setting it aside. And at the very bottom of the tin, wrapped in a square of blue cotton cloth, was something else entirely. She unwrapped it and found a small watercolor painting on thick paper, about the size of a sheet of stationery, showing the garden in full summer, the lavender beds in deep purple bloom, the roses open in pink and white and cream, the stone paths winding through the beds, the greenhouse in the background with its panels bright in the sunlight, the oaks in full green leaf at the edge, and the creek just visible beyond them catching the light. And in the foreground of the painting, small but present, a woman was crouching in one of the beds with one hand in the soil and the other holding a small plant being set into the earth. She stood in the greenhouse in the cold November night with the painting in her hands and looked at that woman for a very long time. She could not see the face. The figure was too small in the painting for that level of detail, but the woman in the painting was wearing a red jacket, exactly like the one Eleanor had bought at the shop in town a few weeks earlier, and the woman in the painting had hair the particular length and wave that Eleanor's own hair had settled into after a month without a proper haircut. She held the painting for a long time, and then wrapped it back in the blue cloth and held it against her chest, and stood in the greenhouse with her eyes closed, listening to the night outside the glass, the creek, the wind high in the oaks, the deep silence of a November mountain at night. Then she went back inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the painting propped against the wall where she could see it, and she looked at it while she drank her tea, and she thought, Here is what she knew by the end of that night. She did not know how Vera had known, did not know when or how or why any of it was the way it was. The note on the nightstand, the painting, the photograph in the hallway, and she had tried several practical explanations on for fit and had set each one down again because none of them fit properly, and she was someone who paid attention. And when something did not fit, you paid attention to that rather than forcing the fit. And here is what else she knew. Whatever Vera had known or foreseen or understood, the practical and present reality of it was simply this: that a woman had come to this house young and alone and had made a life here with patient attention and daily care, had tended a garden and read books and written journals, and loved a man and loved these mountains and this creek and these oaks and these birds, and had paid attention consistently and carefully to the small things every day for decades. And what had come of it was a life of such beauty and such presence that someone who had never properly known her could come and sit in her kitchen many years later and feel it in the air of the rooms, could feel it in the weight of a clay bird held in the palm of the hand, could feel it in the smell of old lavender in the walls, could feel it in the page of every journal on the shelf beside the fireplace. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, very nearly everything. December came to the valley with the particular authority of mountain December, and the first snow fell on a Sunday morning early, while Eleanor was still in bed, and she heard it before she saw it. That specific hush that snow brings, the way the world goes quiet under its weight as though the snow is asking for something and the world is agreeing. She got up and went to the window and looked out at a world that had become white and simple and very still, the garden white, and the oaks white, and the greenhouse roof white, and the stone paths gone entirely under a smooth and even covering that made the whole yard look like a page that had not yet been written on. The creek was still running. She could hear it clearly, actually more clearly than usual. Its sound brighter and more distinct against the silence the snow had brought, and she stood at the window in her sweater with her hands around a coffee mug that she had not made yet, that she had come to the window before making, and she looked at the white yard and the white garden and thought about what was under there. The lavender she had pruned back in October, the roses she had mulched with compost before the ground froze, the tulip bulbs and the narcissus bulbs she had planted in the near beds in November, feeling a little like she was burying something precious and trusting very much in the process. She made her coffee and came back to the window and looked at the snow for a while longer, and then she did something she had not allowed herself to do in a very long time. She started to think about spring, not with the anxious grasping of someone trying to control what comes next. She was going to stay, and she had known it for a while, and she had been letting herself know it gradually and in pieces, the way you learn a new landscape one feature at a time, one morning at a time. She was going to stay, and she was going to restore the garden fully in spring using Vera's plan and her own additions, and she was going to repaint the exterior of the house where the white was peeling on the south-facing walls, and she was going to set up the study properly as a workspace for her design work. She wrote to Gerald Foss that afternoon, sitting at Vera's desk with the amber lamp on and her coffee cooling beside her, and she told him she was keeping the house, that the property was not being listed or sold or rented, that she was keeping it. She stared at what she had written for a moment and then sent the email, and Gerald Foss replied within the hour with a single sentence, "I had a feeling you might say that. Vera would be very glad. Let me know what you need." She put her face in her hands for a moment and smiled into her palms, and the creek ran outside the window, and the snow settled softly on the garden, and the mountain held the valley in its ancient, patient, indifferent embrace. Christmas came quietly and warmly in a way she had not expected, but that felt, in retrospect, entirely appropriate for this particular valley in this particular year. Dottie had her over for Christmas dinner, and there was a small and wonderful gathering of people in Dottie's warm kitchen, Dottie's daughter and her husband, a neighboring couple who were funny and smart and easy to be around, and a young man named Patrick who was an environmental science grad student studying the watershed and who had strong and specific opinions about native plant species and who reminded Eleanor, in a way she found both amusing and touching, of herself at 26. Earnest and precise and entirely convinced that the specific thing she was paying attention to was the most important thing in the world. She ate too much and laughed more than she had in months. And driving back down the gravel road in the dark afterward with her headlights on the snow-edged gravel and the stars very bright and very many overhead, she thought that this was exactly how it starts. This right here. This small, warm evening with its food and its laughter and its particular cast of characters. This was exactly and precisely how a life in a place begins. In January, she set up her workspace in the study properly, running a cable for the monitor and organizing the desk so that it was genuinely both Vera's desk and hers. Vera's photograph placed on the left corner, her own coffee mug on the right. The river stone from the mantel shifted here as paperweight or talisman or some combination of both. She took on new clients and reconnected with old ones, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that her work was better in this house than it had been in years, quieter in its confidence, more deliberate, less apologetic. She had always been a little apologetic about her work, offering qualifications before anyone had questioned anything, diminishing things before they could be diminished by someone else, and she had not entirely known she was doing it until she stopped, because in this house, in this study, with the creek outside and the oaks moving in the winter wind, there was nothing in the air that suggested her work needed apologizing for. She had been working in rooms where she did not feel fully like herself, and the work had known it even when she had not. In February, she began drawing the spring garden plan, spreading Vera's original graph paper plan across the kitchen table and studying it with the reverence it deserved, then beginning to add to it carefully and thoughtfully, her own instincts in careful conversation with Vera's intentions, her own knowledge of plants in respectful dialogue with the knowledge accumulated across those 12 journals on the sitting room shelf. She ordered seeds from 3 different suppliers, spending evenings at the kitchen table with catalogs that arrived in the mail smelling like paper and the particular kind of promise that seed catalogs carry, the promise that everything you are imagining is possible, that the gap between the photograph and the actual bloom is bridgeable, that the work of your own hands in your own specific earth is enough. Patrick came by one afternoon in February to talk about the creek, carrying a clipboard and a set of water sample jars and the serious, kind manner of someone who has chosen the right thing to spend their attention on and knows it. He spent 2 hours explaining the hydrology of the valley, and Eleanor listened with the full attention Vera would have recognized. And he told her that the creek had been in better condition in the 90s, but had been affected by some agricultural runoff in the early 2000s and was recovering now, and that the position of the property in the valley meant the groundwater was exceptional, and that the old oaks along the creek were probably close to 200 years old. She looked at those oaks with new eyes after he left, standing at the kitchen window in the February gray and looking at the great bare shapes of them against the winter sky, and she thought about 200 years, about everything those trees had stood through in this valley, every war, every storm, every human drama, every season cycling through, and they were still here, their roots down in the deep old groundwater, their crowns moving in whatever wind was moving today, and she felt something she could only describe as honored to be under them, honored to be in this particular place at this particular moment in the long ongoing story of this valley. March came to the valley like a long, slow breath being released after a held winter, and the snow began to go from the garden in irregular patches, the dark earth emerging first around the south-facing stone wall where the sun hit earliest, and then in the turned centers of the beds where the soil absorbed heat more readily. And as the snow went, the garden came up. First the snowdrops she hadn't known were there. She had not found them in Vera's written plan, which made her think they were very old, self-seeded over decades from an original planting she would never trace. Coming up in a drift near the greenhouse door, small and white and absolutely determined, their petals almost translucent in the early March light. And she crouched over them for a long time, just looking. Then the crocuses along the south wall in purple and yellow and white. Then the first green spears of tulip leaves pushing up through the dark earth with that particular blind certainty of spring bulbs. Then the narcissus, dozens of them, naturalizing slowly along the stone path edges in the patient, spreading way of bulbs that have been in a place long enough to feel they belong there. And then the lavender, which she had pruned back in October to woody stems and had worried about since. Worried she had taken too much. Worried the plants were older than they could manage that kind of treatment. Worried she had misread the advice she had been given. And in late March the new growth came from every pruning cut she had made. She planted through April and into May with her hands in the earth each morning, working from Vera's plan and her own additions both. The smell of warm soil and growing things around her constantly. The particular pleasure of placing a plant into ground you have prepared yourself, and knowing that everything about this moment is the result of work and attention and care. She planted heritage roses along the fence line and new lavender varieties in the expanded beds and a kitchen herb garden near the back step where she could harvest easily and often. She planted native wildflowers along the creek bank, species Patrick had helped her choose that would benefit the watershed, and she thought often about that relationship. The water and the plants and the roots and the bank and the light and the soil all in a relationship of mutual sustaining, each thing helping the other things simply by being fully and properly itself. Dottie came over most Saturdays through spring and into summer, and they gardened together in a companionable rhythm that had developed naturally and that Eleanor found she relied on more than she might have expected, not only for Dottie's considerable practical knowledge, which was genuine and extensive and freely given, but for her company, for the particular pleasure of working alongside someone who loved the same kind of work, who talked about growing things with the intimacy of someone, who had actually been there for all of it and was glad to share. On a Saturday in late May, while they were planting the last of the lavender seedlings along the back bed with the creek running in the background and the oaks in their first full June leaf overhead, Dottie said without looking up from what her hands were doing that Eleanor was going to be all right here. She knew that, and Eleanor looked at her for a moment and said that she knew it too, and Dottie nodded and kept planting. Summer arrived in the valley the way summer arrives in mountain valleys, all at once and fully, the heat settling into the low land, the thunderstorms coming up over the ridge in the afternoons with tremendous authority and leaving the air washed clean and smelling of ozone and wet earth and the particular sharpness of hot stone that has been rained on. The garden became what Vera's plan had always promised it could be, given the right attention and the right hands and the right amount of time. The lavender was a long shimmering wave of purple along the back of the yard, fragrant from the kitchen window with the right wind, fragrant standing anywhere near it with any wind at all. The heritage roses opened in successive waves through June and July, pink and cream and deep red, and the smell of them on a warm evening with the back door open was something she found herself unable to take for granted no matter how many times she encountered it. The kitchen herbs were demanding to be used, and she used them, cooking in a way she had not cooked in years, with fresh things from the garden and the particular satisfaction of using something you grew yourself. Wildflower strip along the creek bank was alive and busy, bees and butterflies, and every morning precisely at 8, a hummingbird who came to the bee balm and spent 20 dedicated minutes working it, and then departed with the same punctual precision, which she found deeply admirable. She had begun leaving the back door open in the evenings in May and had not stopped. She sat at the kitchen table with the door open and the garden open beyond it, and the oaks beyond that, and the creek beyond those, the whole thing continuous, no boundary between inside and out. the air moving through from the garden and carrying lavender and whatever she had cooked, and the evening dampness rising from the creek, and it all went together in a way that felt like what she had been reaching for, without having the right words for it, for most of her adult life. She thought sometimes about the note, in those evenings, thought about how it had been on the nightstand that first night in a locked house in a room prepared by someone who said she had not left any note, and she had arrived, over the months, at a comfortable peace with that mystery. The kind of comfortable peace you arrive at with a mystery that is not hostile to you, that seems, in fact, to have your specific interest at heart. She had come to think of Vera not as someone who was gone, but as someone who was simply somewhere else, close enough that in the right conditions, standing in the right spot, paying the right quality of attention, you could almost hear her. On an evening in August, she was sitting at the kitchen table with the back door open and her laptop open in front of her, working on a project for a small publishing house she had been with for several months, and the work was going well the way it went well regularly now. In this house, in this quiet. She looked up from the screen and out the back door at the garden in the August evening light. That specific low gold light of August evenings that comes in at an angle and turns everything it touches into something just slightly more than itself. And the lavender was gold, and the rose stems were gold, and the stone paths were gold, and the surface of the creek visible through the oaks was gold, and the oaks themselves in their full August leaf were gold, and the everything was gold, and breathing and utterly, exactly itself. She sat there looking at it, and she thought, I am happy. Not the qualified kind. Not the kind with conditions and caveats and the awareness of everything that still needed healing or resolving or working through. Just the simple and present thing, here in this kitchen, in this light, with this garden, and this creek, and these oaks. Happy. The way you are happy when you are finally, after a long time of being somewhere else, exactly where you are. In September, exactly a year after she had arrived, she walked down the gravel road to where it met the highway and stood at the old mailbox in its honeysuckle, which was going golden now, beginning to thin toward fall. The number on the mailbox was still barely readable, and the post was still leaning slightly, and it was still exactly the kind of thing you could drive past 100 times without seeing. She stood there looking at it and thought about the woman who had driven past this spot a year ago in the rain with $43 and a canvas-belted suitcase and an address on a gas station receipt. The woman who had almost not stopped, who had been on the far side of a year that had taken from her things she had believed she needed and had turned out not to need after all. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could. She thought she would say very little, actually, because there are some things that cannot be adequately described to the person standing before them, some things that can only be inhabited, one morning at a time, one lavender bed at a time, one evening by the fire with someone else's journal open in your hands. She walked back up the gravel road to the house. The oaks were beginning to turn at the tips, just beginning, the first gold appearing at the edge of the leaves the way dawn appears at the edge of the horizon, tentative and inevitable at once. The creek was running with its particular fall brightness, copper-colored in the light, cold against the stones. The greenhouse was full of propagated cuttings, lavender plants and herb seedlings that she was going to bring to Dottie on Saturday, and some to Patrick, and some to the woman at the farmer's market in town who had admired her lavender in July. She walked up the 3 wooden porch steps, and she sat down, for the first time in a year, in one of the old rocking chairs. She had looked at these chairs every single day since she arrived and had not sat in them, for no reason she could have named precisely other than that the time had not seemed right, and now the time seemed right, and she sat in the one on the left and rocked gently and looked out at the valley. The September sky was the deep and specific blue of September, the blue that is more itself than any other color of sky, that has something final and beautiful about it before the season changes, and the oaks moved in a slow, wide rhythm overhead, and the creek ran in its constant and patient way below, and the valley spread before her in the late afternoon light, golden and green and deeply, quietly alive. She sat in Vera's rocking chair on Vera's porch in a September afternoon, and she felt, at the very bottom of everything, at the place below thought and below language where certain truths live, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, not in the resigned sense, not in the making the best of it sense, but in the full and genuine sense of someone who has found the specific place and the specific life that fits them, or that they have made to fit them, which in the end amounts to the same thing. The house had told her, in its own time, exactly as the note had promised. She rocked gently as the afternoon moved toward evening and the light went gold, and the first bat came out from under the porch eave and began its wheeling, irregular circuit of the yard, and the great horned owl called from somewhere in the far oaks. 2 long calls, and then a pause, and then 2 long calls again, reliable and patient as ever, marking the hour, marking the evening, marking the ongoing turn of things. She listened and she paid attention, and all around her the valley held her in its quiet ancient hands, and the creek ran on as it had always run and would always run, and the evening came in slowly and gently, the way the very best evenings do, as though time itself had decided there was no particular hurry, as though everything were exactly as it should be, and had always been, and always would be, turning slowly and beautifully through its long and patient seasons, tended by those who loved it, remembered by those who stayed. And so Eleanor stayed, through another autumn and another winter and another spring, watching the snowdrops come up again near the greenhouse door with the same quiet gladness she had felt the first time, staying while the lavender grew full and confident in its restored beds, and the oaks turned and released, and turned again in their great unhurried rhythm, staying the way Vera had stayed, with intention and attention, and her hands in the earth, and her heart gradually, patiently, permanently, open to whatever the valley and the house and the slow-turning seasons had to show her next. And the house remembered her, as it had remembered everyone who had ever loved it, holding the shape of her days in its walls, in its rooms, and its deep-rooted, patient silence. If this story carried you somewhere warm and slow and gentle tonight, if it gave you even a few minutes of that particular quiet that comes from being inside a good story on a good night, then I am truly glad, because that is exactly what we are here for at Lantern Lake Stories, night after night, story after story. Subscribe so you are here when the next one arrives, and if tonight's story found you in the right moment, leave a comment and tell us so, because hearing from you is one of the best parts of doing this. And wherever you are tonight, whatever kind of day you are coming from, I hope you feel, just as Eleanor felt in that rocking chair on that September afternoon, exactly where you are supposed to be. Good night, and sleep peacefully.